Welcome to the Peak Mental Performance Podcast with Joe Schillero, optimizing your mental health and athletic performance one episode at a time.
All right, welcome everybody to another episode of the Peak Mental Performance Podcast. I have with me today Joel Jamieson. He is widely considered one of the world's foremost authorities on strength and conditioning for combat sports, having trained many of the sport's best athletes since 2004. He's the author of the best-selling book Ultimate MMA Conditioning and has worked with and consulted extensively for teams and organizations ranging from Navy SEALs to Lifetime Fitness, and his BioForce HRV system, which we're going to talk about here in a few minutes, is used by teams in the NFL, NBA, MLS, NCAA. There's a whole bunch. He's also created the platform 8 Weeks Out back in 2009, in part to clear up confusion regarding energy systems and performance, which is a commonly misunderstood part of training. So thanks, Joel, for taking the time to do this today.
No problem. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So I had purchased your BioForce HRV system a few years ago, and really liked as I learned more about the HRV and what that means to monitoring recovering athletes and some of the applications of that. And it kind of went into, as I progressed more and more, of looking at this relationship between complete comprehensive stress response in athletes and how that translates to performance, how it translates to mental health, and deals with a lot of what we talk about with different guests on this podcast. So kind of to start off before we get into heart rate variability specifically, the reason heart rate variability is so valuable is because of how important it is for athletes to understand stress. And could you talk a little bit about what stress means in the context of an athlete?
Yeah, well, I'll talk a little bit about what stress means just in the context of being a human being, honestly, because it's really the same thing whether you're an athlete or a housewife or anywhere in between. And the best place to start is just to understand that the body has what we call the autonomic nervous system, and that system is responsible for a lot of things in the body. It's responsible for keeping us alive. It's responsible for maintaining the internal environment so that our bodies can produce energy and our cells can function properly, and it's responsible for basically just preparing us for whatever we encounter in our lives. So from a biological perspective, we've got one half called the sympathetic nervous system, which is the fight or flight nervous system, and that system is responsible for cranking up energy production, cranking up force and power, and doing what it sounds like. It's preparing us for fight or flight or emergency type situations. The other half is the parasympathetic system, and that system basically does a lot of the opposite functions. In the sympathetic, it's responsible for energy storage, and it's anabolic, and it puts everything back and improves digestion, all those things. So really, stress in itself is anything that knocks us out of kind of a balance of those two systems and towards the sympathetic side, because that sympathetic side, like I said, it's where energy production increases, it's where homeostasis, it's where homeostasis essentially gets disrupted a bit or shifted over to the sympathetic catabolic side. So stress is really anything that puts us in a sympathetically dominant state. Now, the interesting thing here is that it's not limited to just physical things. So, of course, if we lift weights or we do sprints, obviously we need more energy, so our sympathetic system turns on to help us do that. But it can also be imagined. So if you sit there and think about something mentally stressful, if you're worried about paying the bills or you have a deadline due for school or work assignment, those mental type activities activate that same sympathetic nervous system, and they actually turn on energy production, inflammation, all things go along with it. So really, stress is anything real or imagined that causes a sympathetic response.
Yeah, it's a great summary of a complex system, and I think it's a lot of times people don't really look enough at how stress involves all of those things, and it plays into the like you said, the ability for athletes to recover and everything. And they did some research at Mizzou this past year where they looked at football injuries, and they saw that some of these injuries actually occurred more during high stress academic times than even high stress competition times. And that just goes to show you how these, you talk about in your book on HRV, this non-specific stress, this idea of having to look at athletes' training as it's not just them being under the barbell, it's everything. And I think that's, hopefully coaches are starting to come along to that idea, but I think for a long time, like you said, we used to think of it just as the sprints, as the weight training, things like that.
Yeah, people have to realize, and I think this is something that will hopefully come to the forefront sooner rather than later, it's that training itself is purely the stimulus. It doesn't actually once you do the training session, that's when the changes occur, is afterwards during the process of recovery, when the body is shifted away from that sympathetic state that was in during a workout and hopefully shifted into a parasympathetic state where the body is anabolic. It's rebuilding tissues. It's making them bigger. It's making them stronger. It's increasing hormones to facilitate protein synthesis to do that. All these things are happening during the periods of recovery. I mean, that's where fitness actually changes. Your fitness doesn't change in the weight room doing a sprint. It changes afterwards. So if we're doing things outside of the gym that are pushing us back into that sympathetic state, back in that stress state, we're essentially pushing ourselves away from recovery. We're pushing ourselves away from adapting and getting stronger and getting faster and getting bigger and doing all those things. So absolutely what you see is that when people are extremely mentally stressed or they're not sleeping well or whatever the case may be, rather than spending 8 hours in a good recovery state, they're spending 8 hours in a stressful state, and they're taking away from that recovery. So rather than having a bunch of energy being devoted to rebuilding bigger muscles, like I said, now your energy is just going to deal with that stress, or whether it's real or perceived. Your body's in a catabolic state for 8 hours versus shifted into a more anabolic recovery-driven state. And of course, recovery suffers, injuries go up, and performance decreases. All those sorts of things. So you can't look at training as the only component to your fitness. You have to look at everything else that happens in between the training sessions as just as important or even more important, because that's where the changes are actually taking place that improve your fitness and performance.
Yeah, absolutely. And I try to, when I present to different people, students or coaches, and I try to kind of relate it to, it's like, if you're going from training as a stress to then going to your lifestyle that is filled with other types of stress and you're never getting a break, it's like just having your foot down the gas pedal 24/7. And it wouldn't be good for the car engine. It's not good for us either. So I think people understanding, I think it's easy for athletes and coaches to shrug off like things that are typically parasympathetic because it's not as hardcore or whatever. But it's like, like you said, if an athlete is constantly in sympathetic mode, it's just going to lead to burnout. So kind of on that note, what are some risks that athletes face when they're essentially in that sympathetic all the time and they just keep pushing and pushing and pushing? What does that kind of lead to if they're not monitoring their recovery correctly?
Yeah, well, the biggest thing obviously is it increases your risk for injury and decreases your performance potential. And really the way that happens is all these stress hormones chronically are bombarding the bloodstream. So you have cortisol and adrenaline and all these different stress hormones that are, again, their role is to help prepare the body for fight or flight. If you're chronically flooding your body with them, eventually you become somewhat resistant to them. So you can get cortisol resistance. You can have the adrenergic receptors burn out. The catecholamines like adrenaline bind to. And essentially what happens then is your body starts producing more and more and more of those hormones. You dump a ton of cortisol in the bloodstream. You dump a ton of adrenaline into the bloodstream. And you essentially just put your hormones in a state of imbalance that you don't want them in, and that leads down all sorts of problems. So, for example, if you're resistant to cortisol and your cortisol is not doing the job it's supposed to do, then your inflammation starts becoming rampant, and you go from acute inflammation, which is stimulating the body to repair itself, to chronic inflammation, which is causing the body to shut down and have all sorts of problems. So, really it's just a range of things. You're not going to feel good. You're not going to want to train. You're not going to have the energy to train. You're going to increase your appetite and start wanting to eat more, and you're going to crave sweet foods. Your overall strength potential is going to go down. Just you get injured. All the whole host of things that we see with your chronic, overtraining. But personally, I think that people in general live in this chronic overreaching state where they maybe don't feel terrible all the time, but they also don't feel great, and they maybe can maintain some level of performance, but they also don't get better. To me, that's a more common problem that's difficult to see. Because once someone really hits an overtraining state, it. I mean, they just don't want to work out there, or they get injured. It's obvious. But I think the bigger problem, again, is more people live in this chronically not great state where again it's more subtle, but they plateau. They've been doing the same weight, the same speed, the same heart rate, the same whatever for months on end, and they're not really improving. They're not getting better, but they're still putting work in. I think that's where most people tend to live these days, is in kind of that quasi state between training well and having balanced and an overtraining state. They live somewhere in the middle where they're not quite getting better, but they're not quite feeling bad enough to do something about it.
Yeah, definitely. I completely agree. And I think sometimes, over the years, as people have had their back and forth discussions about overtraining and how common is it, does it exist, all these things. I think I think it being called overtraining is what gets people, because then they think like, well, I'm not training too much. And it might not be that you're training too much. It might be you have no recovery built into your training or your week, or, if you're going home to like you said, barely paying the bills, relationship stress, you're failing out of school, all these things. And like, then a couple days a week of training could turn into overtraining quicker than you'd think it would.
Yeah, I mean, it's better to just think of it as overstress. It's probably the better way to look at it.
Yeah, absolutely. I
Trains
completely
only
agree.
one trains. And realistically, here's the thing: is I can tell you years and years of looking at HRV is training is an hour a day, 2 hours a day, whatever it may be for people. Life is the other 22, 24, whatever. That's where the real stress accumulates. The workout is a fairly small part of the average person. Even athletes, still a fairly small part of total daily hours spent. So even if you have everything in control in the gym, or you feel like your workouts are balanced, if you go spend 8 hours worrying about things and running around and running yourself into the ground, it has a far bigger impact than the training itself.
I completely agree. And I think it goes back to what you said before about perceived stress is a big deal too. And I think especially in the powerlifting world, but in all athletics, a lot of times it's hard for people to not feel like they're just being, by addressing that psychological side. They're like, oh, it's just, just being a pussy. And it's like, no, like if you're not managing your recovery, do you want to be making progress or not, and those things are a big part of it.
I mean, I can tell you, here's proof that a lot of people are in that state, though, is how many people drink coffee, endlessly and some sort of stimulant. Well, why do you think you need that? You need that because your body has become so resistant to a lot of the stress hormones. You chronically have to flood your body with stimulants to get that normal energy. You shouldn't need to live on coffee to have a normal day. So you see so many people that are, Starbucks' entire corporation's built on that. So you can see how much time we spend in a stress state because we're sitting there constantly trying to find stimulants just to get more energy throughout the day.
Oh, absolutely. And I think you see it turn into a downward spiral really quick too, because then if you're overdoing the stimulants and you're pushing all those hormones even harder, and then your circadian rhythm gets thrown off, and then training gets screwed up, and then you're stressed out because training's not going good. It's this quick downward spiral I think people can find themselves in.
Yep, absolutely. I mean, I did a little talk recently, and one of the things I looked at some research of is over the last 20 years or so, I think something like 20 or 30% more Americans have gym memberships or health club memberships. They're spending an average of 50 to 100% more time per week being physically active than they used to back in the 80s. And yet obesity has jumped by almost a third over the same period of time. So people are more active, but they're getting fatter. So why is that happening? Well, it's happening because people are getting more and more stressed. It used to be you'd go to work and you'd go home and you'd have some sort of separation between the two. But now you've got your mobile phone, checking your email, doing your text messages, jumping on your Facebook. I mean, we live in this constantly stimulating, stressful world. And people's sleep has suffered, people's quality of life in some ways has suffered, but realistically what it's led to is just a lot more stress that even though we're being more active, it's causing more total stress in our daily lives. And you see people, getting fatter and not getting in better shape despite the fact of being more active.
No, absolutely. I think, you see that with, like you said, like with work, with, the fact that we can stay up with artificial light till 4 a.m, which isn't the most natural thing. And, and then you have people who may just have a, generalized anxiety. And then, we're living in this modernized world where it's nonstop information overload, and it just makes it a little worse. So kind of with, we talked about this stress management importance and how important it is to know, if you're in that sympathetic side of your autonomic nervous system all the time, or if you're getting enough time in the parasympathetic to allow yourself to recover. So that kind of brings us to this topic of heart rate variability, not to be confused with just heart rate, which I think a lot of times people, when they're trying to search and don't know much about it, confuse the two. So what is heart rate variability, and how does it play a role in all of this?
Yeah, I mean, the simplest terms, heart rate variability is a measure of that parasympathetic nervous system's activity. So, like we talked about, the parasympathetic nervous system is responsible for rest, digest, recovery, supercompensation. It's responsible for rebuilding yourself and putting everything back together and making it bigger and stronger. So, it's really the system that drives fitness because, again, it's driving the changes that make you more fit. So, heart rate variability is just basically it's a mathematical way of measuring the patterns in your heart wave, and those patterns essentially give us insight into how active and how effective that parasympathetic nervous system is functioning. So when we see a higher number, it tells us that the parasympathetic system is more active, and by inverse, we know the sympathetic system is then in a lower activation state, and you're more parasympathetically dominant. If we see a lower number, then we see the opposite. We know that you're in a more stressed state and driven away from recovery states. And then over time, we can look at your baseline to see how well your body is improving, adapting, and functioning essentially relative to the stress of life and everything you're doing to it. And people with higher HRVs, they're generally more stress resilient. They can handle stress better because that parasympathetic nervous system can be developed just like any other fitness quality. And the more you develop it, the more it's able to cope with stress properly. So that number, that measure of heart rate variability correlates extremely well to cardiovascular disease and diabetes and inflammation and all sorts of things, because again, that parasympathetic system's ability to handle stress is hugely important to health and wellness and performance, because it's all about that system is responsible for improving our fitness and improving our performance and making sure we can recover from everything. So it's a hugely valuable number. It's a hugely valuable metric because, again, of the implications of how wide-ranging stress is to us, not just from performance, but again, from a health and wellness standpoint as well.
Yeah, definitely. And it's been interesting over the last few years, especially the more I've been getting involved in some of these things, seeing that now you're seeing counselors are using HRV with their student athletes to help them get buy-in on this stress management concept. And I think it's the thing that really interested me in HRV was, I think with trying to get athletes or lifters or just general people to buy into this idea of managing stress and recovery better, sometimes it feels very kind of spacey and out there to people, and HRV provides a concrete measurement that I think for type A personalities, it's okay, now I get to see where this is at, and am I getting better, like you said.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm from Seattle, so we have home Microsoft and Amazon, and you have a lot of type A, or at least numerically driven people, and that's kind of the biggest thing I learned. I've been using heart rate variability since early 2000s, and you show these Microsoft guys or these tech guys graphically or numerically how much their lives were impacting them, and all of a sudden it was a big eye-opener that they realized that not sleeping because they were working on deadline for a project or playing some video game all night long actually had a much bigger impact on them than, again, the workout they did that day. So it's definitely an eye-opening thing when you can visually see a response inside the body versus just talking about, I feel tired. Well, feeling tired and seeing your HRV plummet are two different things for most people. So it's definitely got a lot of value just from that standpoint.
Yeah, and it seems like there's a lot of value in identifying trends too for people, that kind of forces them to be a little more accountable to it. If they see that, when I was measuring HRV and I was traveling a lot on the weekends for conferences and things to lead FTS and coaching, it's you'd see these, I would see how I always knew traveling stressed me out, and then you see the tangible impact of how HRV would change based on if you traveled, if you stayed somewhere that wasn't your own bed, whatever.
Oh, yeah.
And it kind of forces you to recognize okay, I need to make sure that I'm mindful of all those things in my training, as much as it would seem common sense of, hey, I had a stressful weekend, maybe I should keep that in mind when I go into the gym. It's so easy for us to forget that or to just ignore it.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's an accountability tool as much as anything else that keeps you honest, because you can lie to yourself or convince yourself that you can handle it, but then the numbers don't lie. They show you a very clear picture of what sort of stress you're under and how well your body responding to it.
Absolutely. So with heart rate variability, like you said, you've been using this since the early 2000s. Your resources that you had in your system was one of the first things that I kind of got into when I was starting to research it more and look at tools with it. Can you talk a little bit about your BioForce HRV system? And I know you mentioned to me the other day you've got some new things that are coming out with that too, and kind of what you have going on right now with it.
Sure. I mean, the first systems that I used were really clinically oriented towards teams that want to spend thousands of dollars and have professional staff looking at their data, and it was really it was out of reach for the average person to use. And then fortunately, we got cell phones and technology improved. And in late 2010, 11, I started working on putting something together that would be more accessible to the average person. And really, that's what I built the system around. I mean, even though it's used by athletes and teams all over the world, it's also very easy for someone with no background in HRV to use. And so it gives you a couple of things. First, it just gives you a color every day, a green, amber, red, and that basically tells you how much stress your body is under for that given day and how much training or how much more stress is appropriate for you if you want to see continued improvement. So if you get a green, it means you're under fairly low stress and you're fairly well rested. If you're an amber, it's a moderate level of stress, moderate fatigue, and a red is high stress, high fatigue. And so that just kind of helps guide essentially the training process. Now, just because you're amber red, it doesn't mean you can't train hard or you can't perform well. It just means that if you continually train hard in those zones, eventually you will absolutely overtrain. So it just helps guide that training process or helps you make smarter decisions on a daily basis. And the second thing it gives you is a number, and that number is your actual score that represents your level of parasympathetic function or heart rate variability. So again, over time, you want that number to be, higher is not always better, but you want that average number to be in the higher ranges, and that tells you that you're able to handle stress better, you're lower risk for diseases, you're at low risk for injuries, all those sorts of things. So really, you've got two things. You've got kind of that short reaching every day. Here's a color to help me understand what's appropriate for the day and what's not. And then you've got your trends, which gives you your moving average over time and helps you gauge whether or not your fitness and your HRV is actually improving and making more stress resilient, or if you're overloading the body and making it worse. So yeah, it's designed just to be really simple and easy to use. The nice thing about HRV is it's not something you have to spend 20 hours a day measuring and tracking. It's a 2.5 minute test you do, preferably in the mornings. You get your score and your color for the day, and you use that to again make better decisions about your training and hopefully everything else as well.
Yeah, and I think from my own experience with it, and as I've looked more into it, and I think there's a lot of value too, and even outside the day to day, looking back at trends over, say, like if you're an athlete looking at, or a coach, you're coaching a student athlete, looking over trends over the course of a season or a semester, or if you're a power lifter, looking at trends over the course of a training cycle, because I think you learn a lot from like, oh man, like these, if you have to reorganize your training days, or you need to be careful of certain things that happen during the week and how that affects it. I think it's really good for identifying some things, like you said, kind of for accountability.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll tell you one thing I've noticed. I'll tell you two things. Number one, we've noticed a really strong correlation in team performance at the end of the season versus the beginning, in teams that can at least maintain their average HRV as a whole for the majority of their starters. The athletes that see these big drops in HRV over the course of the season, or the teams that see that, and a good percentage of athletes, they just perform poorly in the season. The athletes are the teams that can maintain it. They perform a whole lot better. So just looking at, did your team maintain their HRV over the course of a season? Did it get progressively worse? Is a really important question to answer. And if the answer is it got worse, the question is what caused that and what can you do to fix it next year? So I think that's a really important thing that teams and really anybody can use. And then the second thing is just from an individual standpoint. Anytime you're leading up to a competition, especially like I work a lot with combat athletes, and they have training camp after training camp, so you can use it to really see, to benchmark yourself. Where were you at? What was your HRV score 8 weeks out last time? Where were you 6 weeks out? Where are you at now compared to that? It helps, essentially just gives you, again, like a benchmark to see if you're on the right track compared to a previous training camp, if you're ahead of schedule, if you're behind. It helps you manage that and really provides a better gauge of, are you on track or not, than just kind of how you feel.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a good way for, like you said, if people have consistently poor heart rate variability, their ability to handle additional stress is not good. So it's like, it's like if you consistently are scoring poorly, it's like you've got this like rickety little table, and if you're about to dump an entire season's worth of stress on it, it's probably not going to turn out very well. And they've actually, I read some research a few months back too, of like they looked at Marines that they tested their HRV going over before they went on deployment in combat zones, and there's a correlation between how poor their HRV was and how the tendency they had to have PTSD symptoms after combat. So it's like it all feeds into this idea of like, if you're constantly in this sympathetic state and your ability to recover is diminished, like your ability to handle additional stress is going to be diminished too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, all forms of stress, whether they're real or imagined, have an effect on the body, and the whole benefit to having higher parasympathetic function that you see as higher HRV is that you can you can overcome that. Your body can turn off that stress. It can turn on the recovery process, and it can amplify it. So it's, like I said, it's a fitness ability. It's a skill, set on, just like anything else. You can get stronger, you can get bigger, you can get faster. Well, you can also recover better. You can train the body to recover from stress faster. You can train to shut off the sympathetic system faster, and you can train to handle that. So, again, it doesn't surprise me that the people, people serving in very stressful combat-driven situations are going to be able to withstand that stress better if they can shut it off. And I've seen some similar research where they looked at, I think it was the Navy going through like essentially survival school, very high stress, low sleep, mentally demanding period. And they found that people that had very high HRV at rest, in other words, shifted into a recovery state at rest, but then low HRV during the stressor, meaning they could turn on that stress response when needed to. Those are the people that survived the school well and didn't get injured and were able to complete the whole thing, and they actually had better performance on their mental tests that they would administer during it as well. So I think the military's done a lot of very interesting research, and it all basically shows the same thing. The more resilient you are to stress, shown by higher HRV, the more likely you are to handle stress, which shouldn't really come as a surprise, but you see the value of it over and over again.
Yeah, definitely. I'm curious with the athletes and teams you've worked with, how much have you seen like individual athletes' personalities play into this too? Like, do you have athletes that they're able to just kind of like shut off competition or training when it's done and they just recover way better, and then some athletes that you have to really work with not to just be like overstimulated all the time?
Yeah, I mean, there's two things I would say. Number one, personality types, definitely do play a role. People are just, naturally more stressed out than others, whether it's neurotransmitter profiles or whether they're raised or who knows. But there's definitely something to be said for some people just roll with the punches, and some people just let themselves get beat up. And then the second thing I'll just say, there's a big genetic difference. I mean, you'd be amazed. People have good genetics, and I've seen people that have poor lifestyles and poor training, and yet they have very high HRV. They're never hurt. Fitness is amazing. I mean, there's something to be said for just the genetic component as well. And, again, that's kind of the value of having HRV to measure in team settings, because you never know. You might be able to put quite a bit more stress on one athlete than you think, and the other athlete might need far less, or might need at least more recovery. So there's definitely an individual difference in, performance, genetics, lifestyle. All those things dictate how people are going to respond. So if you're not measuring, then you're essentially just guessing, and you're talking about a team of 10, 15, 20, 30 people. That's a lot of guesswork, and chances are you're going to, get it wrong here and there. Yeah,
definitely. So if you have like teams that you've worked with or consulted with before, or that are using HRV, if the coaches they're testing their entire team's HRV, and maybe the overall trend is going in a certain direction, but there's obviously, variances. Like some athletes are going to have really good HRV, some are going to have worse. Do you see coaches in those situations make individual tweaks to some of the athletes' program, or do they generally change the entire team's training a little bit based on just like the general trend of HRV?
It really depends on the team and the athlete and the organization. That's the thing you've got to realize as I'm sure you realize with teams, you're dealing with lots of different coaches with lots of different personalities, and then you're dealing with administrators. You're dealing with a lot of things that convolute or complicate things. So in an ideal world, you would look at the big trend of the overall team. You make decisions about the overall team's training load, and if you see the whole team's going downhill, you better make some adjustments to the entire team practice. Likewise, if you see certain athletes going downhill, even though the team may be doing well, of course you want to adjust that individual's program in some manner to help facilitate recovery. In the real world, some teams are really great at it, and some coaches are very forward-thinking and very progressive, and some coaches aren't. There's teams out there that are using all the technology in the world, from HRV to GPS, and at the end of the day, it's changing absolutely nothing. And then there's teams out there that are collecting very little data, but are extremely intelligent in how they use it and doing a great job with it. So, it just totally depends on the athletes or the coaches, mentality and the mindset and the culture of the organization. And you still have the old school mentalities out there, but they just want to run people on the ground, and they think more is better. And then you have some of the newer coaches that are more open-minded, that are trying to use data effectively, and then you have some that are doing a better job of that than others. So it's kind of the Wild West right now, to be honest with you. There's a wide range of people using data intelligently, and there's people not using it intelligently.
Yeah, it makes sense. Anybody that's worked in strength and conditioning knows that you're dealing with so many variables that a lot of it's out of your control. So, but
Yeah, it comes down to the head coach. I mean, honestly, the strength
yeah,
conditioning staff, they can tell the coach all they want. This athlete's not doing well, or this athlete may be an increased risk of injury. But here's the problem with that is maybe this athlete doesn't look great, but then they go out and have a great game. It's a probability thing. Just because someone's not recovering well, it doesn't mean that every single game they go out and blow their hamstring. They still might perform well, but by the end of the season, that's going to be a different story. So, if the head coach doesn't have the right mindset, and the strength staff says, hey, this person's fatigued, you might want to consider reducing their play, or you might want to consider changing up or whatever, and then the person goes out and performs well, and now the head coach thinks, oh, they didn't know what they were talking about. So you just got to have a really good relationship with the strength staff, the athletic staff, the actual skill coaches side of things. That relationship really drives, to me, a lot of the success of a lot of programs, or the failure of the programs. If you have the head coach who doesn't really want to hear what anyone else has to say, and they're going to do what they're going to do, you better hope they know what the hell they're doing, because they don't, they're going to be on a job, and you might too. So to me, the best organizations have a very team-oriented approach between the training staff, the athletes, the strength conditioning staff, the head coach, and their administrative staff. I mean, the more those people can all be on the same page and have a good relationship and all be working towards the same goal, the better the team's going to ultimately end up being. And I've seen that time and time again. The organization makes or breaks ultimately the success or failure of teams in the long run, from everything I've seen.
Yeah, definitely. I couldn't agree more. When you have athletes, either yourself that you've worked with or just generally, that say are getting consistently poor HRV scores, they just really have trouble getting in a parasympathetic state to be able to recover better. Obviously, like you mentioned, you can make adjustments to their training. What are maybe some other adjustments, if you're working with, say, a combat sport athlete or consulting them, that you would recommend to them to try and improve their HRV if they're consistently getting poor HRV?
Yeah, I mean, there's two things I would look at first. Number one is sleep. Sleep quality and sleep amount makes a huge difference, and also just the sleep consistency. So people with varying schedules where their sleep is, all over the map. Sometimes they sleep at 10, sometimes they sleep at 1. I mean, people with very erratic sleep schedules are going to oftentimes have a difficult time recovering, have lower HRV, just because the body likes regularity, and sleep is one of the biggest drivers of that. So that's the first place I would start. And then, if they're sleeping at the same time, are they actually getting good sleep? Are they comfortable? Is there room and environment, sleep, conducive or not? And then the second thing is, going back to what I talked about earlier, are they sitting there living on stimulants all day long? They pop in Red Bulls and coffees, 3 times, 4 times a day, because that drives HRV lower, drives inflammation, drives lots of things. So those are the two things I would start with always is, how's their sleep, and are they living on stimulants, or, what does their diet look like? And if, both of those look good, then you can look at other things they may be doing in their life that are stressful just from a, lifestyle standpoint. But starting with sleep and starting with, stimulants and nutrition, 90% of the time will point you to why the person's HRV is not doing what you think it should be.
Yeah, that makes sense. I did some research recently. I was going through. They did some research on athletes of even looking at like this kind of artificial jet lag that they get when they have this really erratic schedule of, whether they have to be up certain times of the week, and then on the weekends they completely turn it on its head or whatever. And I think sometimes people don't realize how much that inconsistency, like you said, really affects your body's ability to get to homeostasis.
Yeah, I mean, the body is most comfortable when it's familiar with everything you're doing to it. If it's, when you're in your own bed, in your own house, you sleep better, you feel better, you recover better than if you're in a different city in a hotel bed. And there's a reason for that, because the body's not used to it. It's a different environment. Time schedules could be different. Even just the room you're in is different. Just little differences add up. And so if you're going to bed one night at 10 in the morning, and then you're getting up at 6 a.m. and then 2 days later you're going to bed at 3 in the morning and getting up at 1 p.m. Like, it's going to have a big impact, and it's going to throw the body off. So there's something to be said for consistency in training and consistency in lifestyle. Those things matter.
Definitely. And then on the training side of things, I'm sure some of this varies between the athlete and the sport, but say in somebody's strength and conditioning program, if you're looking for training interventions to help them improve their HRV or help prevent poor HRV scores, do you typically end up tweaking their volume, their intensity? Like what parts of training do you end up usually making adjustments to in order to try and improve that, or does it completely vary from person to person?
No, I mean, I think you always start with volume first, and then if that doesn't do anything, then you look at intensity, and then you look at frequency. Realistically, if you do all those three, and you're still seeing somebody who's not looking well and overtrained, then you might look at adding in a bunch of regenerative methods, or doing a week or two of just significantly reduced training. But generally speaking, I'd start by cutting their volume back, maybe 10, 15, 20%. If that doesn't work, cut back intensity a bit. To do it, intensity a bit. 9 times out of 10, that's enough from a training standpoint to do it. And if you're still not seeing it, like I said, reduce the frequency and look at their lifestyle and see what's going on.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you see, I think your system, like you said, I think is pretty simple to use. It's pretty clear, and it's a nice way for people to be able to see those concrete measurements. Do you see any common mistakes that you think people make when they're trying to use HRV to help them with their training program?
Yeah, I mean, I think the common mistake is people overreact to a single number. And, again, like I talked about earlier before, just because you're, amber or red or you're fatigued today, it doesn't mean like you can't go to the gym and you can't do anything hard. It just means be aware that's where you're at and make little adjustments as necessary. So, people, like I said, they overreact to it, or they try to overanalyze the living hell out of it. Like, you're amber today. Maybe you didn't work out yesterday, but something else happened. Like maybe your sleep was a little off. Maybe you ate something weird. I mean, people try to dissect each and every little thing to the point where, like, it's the human body. There's lots of complex things going on.
Yeah.
It's not as simple as A equals B all the time. Or another thing is people are like, oh, I feel fine, but it's showing I'm amber. Well, if everything you felt was exactly equal to how your body was working, then no one would get hurt. No one would overtrain. But it's not that simple. So I think the biggest thing is it's one piece of information. It's not the end all be all only thing you should consider. You don't coach or train by numbers. You just use that information to make better decisions. And if you use it as such, then it's an incredibly valuable tool. If you start overanalyzing every data point or trying to figure out why this happened versus that happened, and you get paranoid to the point that you're causing yourself more anxiety than you're actually solving, then it's not as effective. So people just need to consider it. It's an information point. It's something to help guide your decisions. It's not making a decision for you. And again, if you use it from that standpoint, then it's an easy thing. It's an easy thing to implement, and you'll see the benefits.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a good perspective for people to understand. And like you said before, that the body's so complex, and I think sometimes people forget how dynamic the body is. It's like our stress response is fluctuating as the day goes on. I mean, you could have a morning where by the afternoon your body's state is in a completely different place. So I think what you said is great for people to understand, is just to use it to inform their decisions and not to get too stressed out about it. At 8 a.m. this morning, this was my number, and feel like that determines their entire day.
Yeah, it's like the stock market, right? Like, are you going to pick your stocks based on the price today, or are you going to look at like some history and just use the price today as one point of where you think it might be headed? It's the same thing. I mean, you don't buy and sell stocks based on one day of information. You shouldn't do it with HRV either. It's just one point to help you make better decisions. It's going to guide the process, but it's not the entire process.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. You mentioned to me that you have some new things coming out with your system too. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, we're in the middle of a redesign here, and really just kind of taking the feedback we've got from thousands of users over the years and kind of my own experiences. And I think the hardest thing, the most challenging thing for people is okay, I have this score, I have this color. What does that mean from a training standpoint today? And it's not an easy question. It does take some experience to really kind of dial that in. And so I think the connection between a lot of this technology, not just HRV, but fitness tracking and sleep tracking and GPS and all sorts of stuff, people are getting a lot of information that can be used effectively, but it's not always easy to do that. So the biggest difference is that the new platform is going to take your HRV, it's going to take your sleep tracking, it's going to take your activity tracking, it's going to take your workouts, and it's going to help give you a training zone for the day, or 2 training zones actually. It'll give you one training zone that'll be a recovery zone. So if you want to drive recovery, you have to keep your heart rate in certain zones that are going to facilitate that. If you go above them, now you're producing more stress and more more sympathetic response than you want, and it's going to push you further away from recovery. So it'll give you basically a recovery heart rate zone to stay in for that particular day, and then it'll give you a conditioning heart rate zone to stay in for the same day. So if your goal is to improve your conditioning, improve your HRV, that's the zone you'd want to stay in. But if your recovery is lower, you'd want to stay more in the recovery zone. So it's ultimately going to take all the data you're collecting already, whether you're using a Fitbit or just your watch, Apple Watch, or anything else, and it's going to give you a recovery score every day, and then it's going to give you those heart rate zones to help simplify that decision-making process. So you say, hey, I really want to improve my recovery. My recovery is not what it should be. Here's your heart rate zone. Maybe it's 120 to 145 or whatever the case may be for the day. You're feeling great. You want to improve your conditioning. Okay, here's your conditioning zone, 150 to 170 or whatever, the sample may be. So again, I'm just trying to help people connect those dots between what intensities are appropriate, and volumes are appropriate, and how that relates to everything else that's going on. So it'll just bridge that gap, I think, between people's metrics and people's lifestyle numbers, and then what that should actually translate to in terms of how hard and what to do in the gym.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's cool because then it also kind of gives the two main kind of personality types, I think, when it comes to training, both what they want of, like, you get some athletes and some coaches even who they want to know, like, the base information to inform greater decisions. And then you have some people who are just like, just tell me what to do.
Yeah, exactly. And then you definitely get both.
Yeah. So I think that'll be nice that you'll be able to give that information that'll kind of inform both. And, and it also probably seems like it'll prevent people from overthinking that number too, like you said, and instead they'll be able to have, like, okay, here's some options that I have.
Yep, exactly. And I think the biggest thing I think people can get a lot of value of is what I call now high performance recovery training. It's going into the gym and training where the goal is not necessarily to stimulate a big improvement in fitness. The goal is to get your body into that recovery zone so that you can realize the improvements that you've already stimulated from the previous workouts. So there's real value in incorporating high performance recovery training into your weekly schedule. And I'm going to help kind of build some educational material around that, so people don't think, oh, if I didn't kill myself in the gym today, it didn't serve any purpose. No, it might serve a big purpose. Not killing yourself, it might actually get your body into that recovery state and speed everything up, so you can see the improvements that you have already stimulated in the high intensity stuff. So part of the new platform again will be teaching people how to incorporate high performance recovery training into their schedules, into their programs, and they'll see the benefits. It's really powerful. I think it's probably the biggest missing element of training actually today is people have this mentality that if they don't go in the gym and go hard, there's no benefit, and that's totally wrong. I mean, there's a huge benefit to going to the gym and stimulating recovery, because again, recovery is what's actually driving the fitness changes you're trying to see.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think the value of recovery workouts, however people phrase them, these feeder workouts, whatever, they're extremely valuable. And I think I see that in the powerlifting world get neglected all the time of, people figure like, oh, as long, I'm going in, I'm doing my 3-4 days a week of my powerlifting training. And then it's like, they just sit around and eat the rest of the time. And it's like, the best powerlifters around will tell you that they do, whether it's light sled drags or walking or, I hike with my dog every day, and it's made a huge difference for recovery for me. And I think, like you said, that's just something that people don't realize how valuable that is in realizing the results of your workout.
Yeah, I mean, it's as valuable as the training itself in many ways, and sometimes it's more value because it can take a program that normally you wouldn't be able to recover well from. It can make it so you can recover from it, and that alone can make a huge difference. So, again, it's been around. I mean, Louis called it extra workouts or GPP work, whatever terminology you want to use. But I think the biggest thing is people need to stop looking at that stuff as an option or an afterthought or something you only do when you're tired. Like, that should be a regular part of your routine, because when you don't do it, you don't see the same results. I mean, instead of adding an extra high intensity session, most people are better off just adding a couple high performance recovery sessions, and then boom, their fitness gets better. It's not magic. It's just facilitating the body getting in that recovery state. And the more you can do that, the more your fitness is going to improve. It's that simple.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a great point. I think this has been some really good information of helping people. We've talked a lot on this podcast about the importance for athletes to understand stress response and this link between their psychological state, their ability to handle stress, and how that turns into performance. And I think, we touched on some good areas with that, and then how heart rate variability can essentially provide a metric for them to help inform their process. You've got some pretty great content that you have between yourself and other people that write on your site. If people want more information about some of the things you do, where can they go to find that?
Yeah, the easiest place is just 8weeksout.com. That's just the number 8 and then weeksout.com. That's where you have articles and videos and podcasts and, like you said, a variety of different people have contributed over the years. And there's, I don't know, a few hundred articles on there, I would say, at this point. That's really the best starting point is just you can go to 8weeksout.com. If you want to find more about BioForce HRV itself, you just go to BioForceHRV.com, and that's where you'll find the specifics of how the system works and what it does and what it measures and what it costs and all those sorts of things. But really, 8weeksout.com is our homepage, and that's where we have all the content, everything we post up to date on there.
Great, thanks, Joel, and I definitely recommend everyone to check it out. It's been some great content for me as I've continued to build, my toolbox, the things that I'm able to use, and I think there's a lot of application for it, even outside of, like we talked about, the performance world. So, thanks for taking the time to chat about this today, Joel. It was a lot of really great stuff.
Yeah, no problem. Happy to be on, and I'm sure we'll talk again soon.